Hello everybody, and how are you? I hope that you're doing well. I hope that the weather is nice where you are. It may not be, so I hope that you've got somewhere nice and dry and out of the weather that you can spend the time at the moment. I can't really do much more than that, I'm sorry. I'm Jev. I live in New Zealand, commonly nicknamed NZ because of the way we say our letter Z. And I read old-fashioned children's stories, usually Victorian and Edwardian ones. Why? Because I grew up with them and they're a whole other world. Sometimes the attitudes are a bit weird compared with our attitudes these days, but the reality is we can actually learn from that. We can learn to recognize when attitudes aren't actually something that we agree with, and we can hear them and we can decide sometimes to act on the fact that somebody else has an attitude that we don't necessarily agree with. Sometimes we can say something that will help them to think about what it is that they've stated. Sometimes we just hold our tongue and wait for a better opportunity. It depends on if you think that the other person is likely to learn from you. And one of the ways that we can educate our minds to be broader in our outlook rather than just the very black and white view that we currently hold, which all of us have to a certain extent, is by entering other people's worlds. And one of the great ways of doing that is to actually listen to or read books from different eras and different parts of the world. So most of the books I read are, as I said before, Victorian and Edwardian, and they are from England. There will be one or two that I'll read a bit later on, probably, that are North American, but most of the ones that I grew up with are English stories. And the stories that I'm reading are very often ones that I've grown up reading, that my parents have grown up reading, and that my grandparents have grown up reading. So they're well loved often, and sometimes they're a new discovery by an author that we're already familiar with. So there you go, that's a bit of background. Oh, and I started reading at the beginning of the coronavirus lockdown here in New Zealand last year. So I've been doing this on and off for the last year and a half. I probably gave it a break for about 6 months, maybe 9 months, I can't remember, but got back into it again and I'm enjoying it. So hey, we're still going. At the moment, I read using my very old first generation iPad mini that my daughter passed on to me. It works great for reading books from. You can't really do anything else. You can't install apps on it anymore. It's too old for that, but it's a good idea to actually keep using technology that otherwise would go into the tip, into the bin, into the rubbish, the trash. It's better to keep using something than to just throw it away and get the latest, greatest, and then do that again in another year or 6 months' time. It's such a waste. Later on, once I actually get my office and the storage boxes and the storage area sorted out, I will actually be reading books, physical books that are ones of my own that I will find in the boxes. I've already done that with one. I did actually find one of the books and read that, which means that you'll actually hear pages turning when I do that. Now, I do not read in a studio. I don't read in a space that is soundproofed, so from time to time you'll hear noises in the background. At the moment, oh, no, he's not there. I thought he was. I was going to say at the moment the lawnmower chap has arrived and he will be doing our lawn mowing, which means that you'll get noise, but he hasn't. He arrived, he spoke to my husband, and he's gone away again. So maybe he's gone off to mow somebody else's lawn and come back when I finish reading. I don't know. We'll find out later on. Well, I'll find out. Maybe I'll remember to tell you, maybe I won't. Doesn't really matter. And also, like if it's really windy, you'll hear wind blowing past the chimney, which is right next to my desk. And it keeps it nice and warm in winter, actually, having the chimney there, because the fireplace is downstairs and the chimney gets all warm from the heat of the fire and it radiates the warmth into my office space, which is wonderful. It also means that when we have a storm, you get to hear the rain. So sometimes I lean in close to my microphone so you can hear me like this, because I'm trying to talk to you over the noise of the rain and the wind and the chimney. Anyway, but I'm not doing ASMR, so don't worry about that. But it does also mean that you'll hear my husband working in the workshop downstairs. And I'm quite happy to not have a soundproofed studio because I think it's a good idea to listen to stories that are being read to you in real life, in people's real places. That's why the very first stories that I read on Twitch, and you will find them if you go to my YouTube channel, the Millie Molly Mandy stories, I read them on my phone. I didn't have a streaming setup. And I also read them from different parts of my house because I thought, oh, we can't get out, we can't go anywhere. It's quite nice to see somewhere else. So let's just do it in a normal house with real people in it. So I try to keep the noise of people in the background to a minimum, but it's not guaranteed, and I'm not intending to have this a sterile, cold, soundproofed environment. It's real life. It's like bedtime stories at home. That also means that when I'm reading something which I think you may not understand, I will interrupt the story and explain it if I think I need to. Sometimes I do it when I don't need to because the author will actually explain something in the next sentence or two. Often it will be a word that the author is very, very familiar with and doesn't explain, so I will explain it for you. And the reason I can is just because I've been reading these sorts of stories from generations before for so long that a lot of things are very familiar. But, fair warning, I have learnt to pronounce the words from reading them, not from hearing them. So, if I say a word and it sounds different to what you're expecting, give me some grace. I've learnt the word from reading it off the page, not from hearing somebody else say it. And there's a lot of us like that. And I chat like this in between chapters, but not while I'm reading a chapter. So you're quite welcome to chat in the chat box alongside if you want with each other, or put notes there for me to see later on, but I will not be interrupting what I'm reading to chat until it's between chapters. So with that in mind, have you got something to drink? Have you got something to snack on? And do you have somewhere comfortable to sit while you're listening? And I shall read. So, New Treasure Seekers by E. Nesbit, subtitled Or the Bastable Children in Search of a Fortune, which I'm pretty sure is the actual subtitle in the first book. And this is chapter 13. Sorry, I have to calculate it because this book doesn't say what the chapter number is. Chapter 13, The Poor and Needy. And I shall read for you now. What shall we do today, kiddies? Said Mrs. Bax. We had discovered her true nature but 3 days ago, and already she had taken us out in a sailing boat and in a motor car, had given us sweets every day, and taught us 11 new games that we had not known before, and only 4 of the new games were rotters. How seldom can as much be said for the games of a grown-up, however gifted. The day was one of cloudless blue perfectness, and we were all basking on the beach. We had all bathed. Mrs. Bax said we might. There are points about having a grown-up with you if it is the right kind. You can then easily get it to say yes to what you want, and after that, if anything goes wrong, it's their fault. And you are pure from blame. But nothing had gone wrong with the bathe, and so far we were all alive and not cold at all, except our fingers and feet. Remember, this is southern England, so it can get a little bit cool in the water. They're in Kent. What would you like to do? Asked Mrs. Bax. We were far away from human sight along the beach, and Mrs. Bax was smoking cigarettes as usual. Now, I'm interrupting myself here because Mrs. Bax is the lady who's living in the house where they are staying while they're off school because they have all had measles. And she has come back from overseas, living in Australia, and apparently she needs a bit of a break before she gets back to doing normal day-to-day stuff in the city, I suppose. I'm not quite sure what. They were told to not interrupt her, not to disturb her too much, and so the previous chapters that we have heard, the children had been on best behaviour, and she thought they were all terribly boring and was a little bit worried about the sort of children they were, and they were a bit worried that she might actually have probably some health issues, and so they were almost tiptoeing around the place and keeping very quiet. And then at the end of the last chapter, we discovered that actually, no, she's lots of fun. She just wanted to do something different for a while, and so everybody else has been told to leave her alone. And now they're discovering just the sort of person she is, which includes having short hair and smoking cigarettes and probably drinking whiskey or something like that, which at the time wasn't really a done thing for women. Not with most of them anyway. But we're going to carry on. So what would you like to do? Asked Mrs. Bax. We were far away from human sight along the beach, and Mrs. Bax was smoking cigarettes as usual. I don't know, we all said politely, but H.O., he's the youngest, said, what about poor Miss Sandal? Why poor? Asked Mrs. Bax. Because she is, said H.O. But how? What do you mean? Asked Mrs. Bax. Now, Miss Sandal is the lady who owns the house that they're living in at the moment. She's not currently in the house because she's in the city looking after her brother who boards with the children's father, and normally they're there as well, in London. And the children have decided that she must be very poor because the house is so plain. Her brother is very keen on improving people and things like that. So I think that's probably more of why she has everything kept very plain. But we will carry on reading. I'm not sure. I can't remember. Maybe Mrs. Bax was one of her sisters. We've actually met one of the brothers apart from the one who lives with their father. He's the chap who had something happen to him, and now everything is about flying, and he wants to fly and he wants to get people to fly, and he draws marvellous pictures with chalk on the walls of the house inside with all sorts of creatures with wings on them, and they're wonderful pictures, but he tends to put people in a slightly dangerous position if left unsupervised, because he wants them to jump off the roof of the house and discover that they can fly, which isn't necessarily a good thing to do. So we shall carry on. What about poor Miss Sandal? Said H.O. Why poor? Asked Mrs. Bax. Because she is, said H.O. But how? What do you mean? Asked Mrs. Bax. Why, isn't she? Said H.O. Isn't she what? Said Mrs. Bax. What you said why about? Said H.O. She put her hands to her head. Her short hair was still damp and rumpled from contact with the foaming billows of the ocean. Now, our narrator often refers to himself in third person, and it's Oswald. And he's discovered big words, and so he likes using big words and big descriptions like you read in some of the books that were around when he was young. So we shall, at the time frame that this is written, so sometimes it gets a little bit wordy, and sometimes he uses words not quite right, not quite correctly, and sometimes the words won't quite actually be a word, but it will remind you of something that is a real word and probably used incorrectly too. I'll carry on. Her short hair was still damp and rumpled from contact with the foaming billows of ocean. Let's have a fresh deal and start fair, she said. Why do you think my sister is poor? I forgot she was your sister, said H.O., or I wouldn't have said it. Honour bright I wouldn't. You don't mention someone's poorness back then. Don't mention it, said Mrs. Bax, not meaning don't talk about it, meaning don't make a big issue of it, and began throwing stones at a groin in amiable silence. Now, on the south coast of England and the southeast coast, to keep the sand in place, they have what they call groins, which are like a wall that goes down the beach to the sea, and it forms a barrier so the sand gets pushed along by the current and by the wind pushing the water, and then stops at that wall, and then you get the next batch of sand, and it builds up like this to the little wall, and then it builds up like that to the next wall, and those little walls are called groins. And so sometimes when you go down to the beach, you go, if it's really windy, you go and sit behind one of the groins so you're not in the wind. But she's throwing stones at a groin. They're very much a part of English beaches. We don't have them so much in New Zealand. We'll carry on. We're throwing stones at a groin in amiable silence. We were furious with H.O., first because it's such bad manners to throw people's poverty in their faces, or even in their sisters' faces, like H.O. had just done, and second because it seemed to have put out of Mrs. Bax's head what she was beginning to say about what we would like to do. So Oswald presently remarked, when he had aimed at the stump she was aiming at and hit it before she did, for though a fair shot for a lady, she takes a long time to get her eye in. "Mrs. Bax, we should like to do whatever you like to do." This was real politeness, and true too, as it happened, because by this time we could quite trust her not to want to do anything deeply duffing, which generally means boring. "That's very nice of you," she replied, "but don't let me interfere with any plans of yours. My own idea was to pluck a wagonette from the nearest bush. I suppose they grow freely in these parts." "There's one at the ship," said Alice. "It costs 7 and 6 to pluck it, just for going to the station." So a wagonette's like a small wagon. And figure of speech, from a bush, like just conjure one up out of nowhere. "Well then, and to stuff our wagonette with lunch and drive over to Linwood Castle and eat it there." A picnic fell in accents of joy from the lips of one and all. "We'll also boil the billy in the castle courtyard and eat buns in the shadow of the keep." "Tea as well," said H.O., "with buns. You can't be poor and needy anyway, whatever your—" We hastily hushed him, stifling his murmurs with sand. "I always think," said Mrs. Bax dreamily, "that the more the merrier is particularly true of picnics, so I have arranged, always subject to your approval, of course, to meet your friends Mr. and Mrs. Redhouse there, and—" We drowned her conclusive remarks with a cheer, and Oswald, always willing to be of use, offered to go to the Ship, that's the local pub, and see about the wagonette. "I like horses and stable yards and the smell of hay and straw and talking to ostlers and people like that." I being Oswald. There turned out to be 2 horses belonging to the best wagonette, or you could have a one-horse one, much smaller, with the blue cloth of the cushions rather frayed and mended here and there, the green in patches from age and exposition to the weather. Oswald told Mrs. Bax this, not concealing about how shabby the little one was, and she gloriously said, "The pair, by all means. We don't kill a pig every day." "No, indeed," said Dora, "but if killing a pig means having a lark, Mrs. Bax, Mrs. Bax is as good a pig killer as any I ever knew." It was splendid to drive, Oswald on the box beside the driver, who had his best coat with the bright buttons, along the same roads that we had trodden as muddy pedestrianators, or travelled along behind Bates' donkey. It was a perfect day, as I said before. We were all clean and had our second best things on. I think second bests are much more comfy than first bests. You feel equivalent to meeting anyone and having a heart for any fate, as it says in the poetry book, and yet you are not starched and booted and stiffened and tightened out of all human feelings. Yes, best clothes in the old days were very, very uncomfortable. Linwood Castle is in a hollow in the hills. It has a moat all round it with water lily leaves on it. I suppose there are lilies when in season. There is a bridge over the moat, not the draw kind of bridge, and the castle has 8 towers, 4 round and 4 square ones, and a courtyard in the middle, all green grass and heaps of stones, stray bits of castle I suppose they are, and a great white may tree in the middle that Mrs. Bax said was hundreds of years old. Mrs. Redhouse was sitting under the may tree when we got there, nursing her baby in a blue dress and looking exactly like a picture on the top of a chocolate box. The girls instantly wanted to nurse the baby, so we let them. That means holding on to the baby and bouncing it in this context. And we explored the castle. We had never happened to explore one thoroughly before. We did not find the deepest dungeon below the castle moat, though we looked everywhere for it, but we found everything else you can think of belonging to castles, even the holes they used to pour boiling lead through into the eyes of the besiegers when they tried to squint up to see how strong the garrison was in the keep, and the little slits they shot arrows through, and the mouldering remains of the portcullis. We went up the 8 towers, every single one of them, and some parts were jolly dangerous. I can tell you, Dickie and I would not let H.O. and Noel come up the dangerous parts, H.O.'s the youngest and Noel's the next youngest, so they're being cautious because, as you've seen with H.O., he doesn't necessarily think before he does something or says something. There was no lasting ill feeling about this, them being held back. By the time we had had a thorough good explore, lunch was ready. It was a glorious lunch, not too many meaty things, but all sorts of cakes and sweets and grapes and figs and nuts. We gazed at the feast, and Mrs. Bax said, "There you are, young Copperfield, and a royal spread you've got." "They had currant wine," said Noel, who has only just read the book by Mr. Charles Dickens. "Well, so have you," said Mrs. Bax, "and we had 2 bottles of it." "I never knew anyone like you," said Noel to Mrs. Redhouse, dreamily with his mouth full, "for knowing the things people really like to eat, not the things that are good for them, but what they like, and Mrs. Bax is just the same." "It was one of the things they taught at our school," said Mrs. Bax. "Do you remember the Saturday night feasts, Chloe, and how good the coconut ice—" Sorry about that. That crept up on me. I shall carry on. "Do you remember the Saturday night feasts, Chloe, and how good the coconut ice tasted after extra strong peppermints?" There's something to try. The extra sweetness of coconut ice after really strong, spicy peppermints. "Fancy you knowing that," said H.O. "I thought it was us found that out." "I really know much more about things to eat than she does," said Mrs. Bax. "I was quite an old girl when she was a little thing in pinafores. She was such a nice little girl." "I shouldn't wonder if she was always nice," said Noel, "even when she was a baby." Everyone laughed at this except the existing baby, and it was asleep on the wagonette cushions under the white may tree. And perhaps if it had been awake, it wouldn't have laughed, for Oswald himself, though possessing a keen sense of humour, did not see anything to laugh at. Mr. Redhouse made a speech after dinner and said, "Drink to the health of everyone, one after the other, in currant wine," which was done, beginning with Mrs. Bax and ending with H.O. Then he said, "Somnus avant, what shall we play at?" And nobody, as so often happens, had any idea really. Then suddenly Mrs. Redhouse said, "Good gracious, look there!" And we looked there, and where we were to look was the lowest piece of the castle wall, just beside the keep that the bridge led over to, and what we were to look at was a strange blobbiness of knobbly bumps along the top that looked exactly like human heads. It turned out, when we had talked about cannibals in New Guinea, that human heads were just exactly what they were, not loose heads stuck on pikes or things like that, such as there often must have been while the castle stayed in olden times it was built in and belonged to, but real live heads with their bodies still in attendance to them. They were, in fact, the village children. "Poor little Lazaruses," said Mr. Redhouse. "There's not such a bad slice of Dives' feast left," said Mrs. Bax. "Shall we?" So Mr. Redhouse went out by the keep and called the heads in, with the bodies they were connected with, of course, and they came and ate up all that was left of the lunch. Not the buns, of course, for those were sacred to tea time, but all the other things, even the nuts and figs, and we were quite glad that they should have them. Really and truly we were, even H.O. They did not seem to be very clever children, or just the sort you would choose for your friends, but I suppose you like to play, however little you are other people's sort. So after they had eaten all there was, when Mrs. Redhouse invited them all to join in games with us, we knew we ought to be pleased. But village children are not taught rounders, and though we wondered why at first why their teachers had not seen to this, we understood presently. Because it is most awfully difficult to make them understand the very simplest thing. But they could play all the ring games, and nuts and may, and there came 3 nights, and another one we had never heard of before. So nuts and may, is a singing game where you go, here we go gathering nuts in May, nuts in May, nuts in May. Here we go gathering nuts in May, early in the morning? I don't know, something like that. And sometimes it's one where you've got people walking in a chain between held up hands and things like that. Anyway, old games. The singing part begins, of this one that was new to them, the singing part begins, up and down the green grass, this and that and thus. Come along, my pretty maid, and take a walk with us. You shall have a duck, my dear, and you shall have a drake, and you shall have a handsome man for your father's sake. I forget the rest, and if anybody who reads this knows it and will write and tell me, the author will not have laboured in vain. The grown-ups played with all their heart and soul. I expect it is but seldom they are able to play, and they enjoyed the novel excitement. And when we had been at it some time, we saw there was another head looking over the wall. "Hello," said Mrs. Bax, "here's another of them. Run along and ask it to come and join in." She spoke to the village children, but nobody ran. "Here you go," she said, pointing at a girl in red plaits tied with a dirty sky-blue ribbon. "Please, miss, I'd liefer not," replied the redhead. "Mother says we ain't to play along of him." "Why, what's the matter with him?" asked Mrs. Redhouse. "His father's in jail, miss, along of snares and night lines, and no one won't give his mother any work, so my mother says we ain't to demean ourselves to speak to him." "But it's not the child's fault," said Mrs. Redhouse. "Is it now?" "I don't know, miss," said the red-haired. "But it's cruel," said Mrs. Bax. "How would you like it if your father was sent to prison and nobody would speak to you?" "Father's always kept hisself respectable," said the girl with the dirty blue ribbon. "You can't be sent to jail, not if you keeps yourself respectable, you can't, miss." "And do none of you speak to him?" The other children put their fingers in their mouths and looked silly, showing plainly that they didn't. "Don't you feel sorry for the poor little chap?" said Mrs. Bax. No answer transpired. "Can't you imagine how you'd feel if it was your father?" "My father always kept hisself respectable," the red-haired girl said again. "Well, I shall ask him to come and play with us," said Mrs. Redhouse. "Little pigs," she added in low tones, only heard by the author and Mr. Redhouse. That's her thoughts on the village children. But Mr. Redhouse said in a whisper that no one overheard except Mrs. Redhouse and the present author, "Don't, Pusscat, it's no good. The poor little pariah won't like it, and these kids only do what their parents teach them." If the author didn't know what a stainless gentleman Mr. Redhouse is, he would think he heard him mutter a word that gentlemen wouldn't say. "Tell off a detachment of consolation," Mr. Redhouse went on. "Look here, our kids, who'll go and talk to the poor little chap?" We all instantly said, "I will." The present author was chosen to be the one. When you think about yourself, there is a kind of you that is not what you generally are, but that you ought, you know you would be. When you think about yourself, there is a kind of you that is not what you generally are, but that you know you would like to be if only you were good enough. Albert's uncle says this is called your ideal of yourself. I would call it your best I, for short. Oswald's best I was glad to go and talk to that boy whose father was in prison, but the Oswald that generally exists hated being out of the games. Yet the whole Oswald, both the best I and the ordinary, was pleased that he was the one chosen to be a detachment of consolation. He went out under the great archway, and as he went he heard the games beginning again. This made him feel noble, and yet he was ashamed of feeling it. Your feelings are a beastly nuisance if once you begin to let yourself think about them. Oswald soon saw the broken boots of the boy whose father was in jail, so nobody would play with him, standing on the stones near the top of the wall where it was broken, to match the boots. He climbed up and said, "Hello." To this remark the boy replied, "Hello." Oswald did not know what to say. The sorrier you are for people, the harder it is to tell them so. But at last he said, "I've just heard about your father being where he is. It's beastly rough luck. I hope you don't mind my saying I'm jolly sorry for you." The boy had a pale face and watery blue eyes. When Oswald said this, his eyes got waterier than ever, and he climbed down to the ground before he said, "I don't care so much, but it do upset mother, something cruel." It is awfully difficult to console those in affliction. Oswald thought this. Then he said, "I say, never mind if those beastly kids won't play with you. It isn't your fault, you know." "Nor it ain't father's neither," the boy said. "He broke his arm a falling off a rick," that's a haystack, "and he hadn't paid up his club money along of mother's new baby costing what it did when it come, so there warn't nothing. And what's a hare or two, or a partridge? It ain't as if it was pheasants as is dear to rear as chicks." So back then, sometimes in villages, you would have a club which you would put a little bit of money into when you could, and then if anything happened, you would get some money back, a little bit like insurance. You'd get a little bit of money back to help you keep going. And so because of the cost of the new baby coming in their family, his father hadn't been able to. So he'd been poaching some hares and pheasants. No, not pheasants. Partridges. Birds that weren't, partridges is a bird that wasn't as valuable at the time. And so therefore he didn't really consider it to be something that was going to cause so much of a problem because he wanted to feed his family. That's what he was trying to do. Oswald did not know what to say, so he got out his new pen and pencil combined and said, "Look here, you can have this to keep if you like." The pale-eyed boy took it and looked at it and said, "You ain't fooling me?" And Oswald said no, he wasn't, but he felt most awfully rum and uncomfy, and though he wanted most frightfully to do something for the boy, he felt as if he wanted to get away more than anything else, and he never was gladder in his life than when he saw Dora coming along, and she said, "You go back and play, Oswald. I'm tired and I'd like to sit down a bit." She got the boy to sit down beside her, and Oswald went back to the others. Games, however unusually splendid, have to come to an end. And when the games were over and it was tea and the village children were sent away, and Oswald went to call Dora and the prisoner's son, he found nothing but Dora, and he saw at once in his far-sighted way that she had been crying. It was one of the A1est days we ever had, and the drive home was good, but Dora was horribly quiet, as though the victim of dark interior thoughts, and the next day she was but little better. We were all paddling on the sands, but Dora would not, and presently Alice left us and went back to Dora, and we all saw across the sandy waste that something was up. And presently Alice came down and said, "Dry your feet and legs and come to a council. Dora wants to tell you something." We dried our pink and sandy toes, and we came to the council. Then Alice said, I don't think H.O. is wanted at the council. It isn't anything amusing. You go and enjoy yourself by the sea and catch the nice little crabs, H.O. dear." H.O. said, "You always want me to be out of everything. I can be councils as well as anybody else." "Oh, H.O., said Alice in pleading tones, "not if I give you a halfpenny to go and buy bull's eyes with." So then he went, and Dora said, "I can't think how I could do it when you'd all trusted me so, and yet I couldn't help it. I remember Dickie saying when you decided to give it to me to take care of, about me being the most trustworthy of us all. I'm not fit for anyone to speak to, but it did seem the really right thing at the time. It really and truly did. And now it all looks different." "What has she done?" Dickie asked this, but Oswald almost knew. "Tell them," said Dora, turning over on her front and hiding her face partly in her hands and partly in the sand. "She's given all Miss Sandal's money," that's the money they'd raised, "to that little boy that the father of was in prison," said Alice. "It was £1.13 and 7 halfpenny," sobbed Dora. "You ought to have consulted us, I do think, really," said Dickie. "Of course, I see you're sorry now, but I do think that." "How could I consult you?" said Dora. "You were all playing cat and mouse, and he wanted to get home. I only wish you'd heard what he told me, that's all, about his mother being ill and nobody letting her do any work because of where his father is. So not only were they... Father was injured. Father couldn't work, so there was no money coming in. So he poached some hares, and not even as good as rabbits, and some partridges for meat, for food, and then he got put in prison, and now mother's ill, and she's got a new baby, and so she can't do any work to get any money for food. I'll carry on. Nobody letting her do any work because of where his father is, and his baby brother ill, poor little darling, and not enough to eat, and everything as awful as you can possibly think. I'll save up and pay it all back out of my own money. Only do forgive me, all of you, and say you don't despise me for a forger and embezzlementer. I couldn't help it. I'm glad you couldn't, said the sudden voice of H.O., who had sneaked up on his young stomach, unobserved by the council. You shall have all my money too, Dora, and here's the bull's-eye halfpenny to begin with. He crammed it into her hand. Listen. I should jolly well think I did listen, H.O. went on. I've just as much right as anybody else to be in a council, and I think Dora was quite right, and the rest of you are beasts not to say so too, when you see how she's blubbing. Suppose it had been your darling baby brother ill, and nobody hadn't given you nothing when they'd got pounds and pounds in their silly pockets. He now hugged Dora, who responded, hugged back. It wasn't her own money, said Dicky. If you think you're our darling baby brother, said Oswald. But Alice and Noel began hugging Dora and H.O., and Dicky and I felt it was no go. Girls have no right and honourable feelings about business, and little boys are the same. A certain attitude that's not the best. All right, said Oswald rather bitterly. If a majority of the council backs Dora up, we'll give in, but we must all save up and repay the money, that's all. We shall all be beastly short for ages. Oh, said Dora, and now her sobs were beginning to turn into sniffs. You don't know how I felt, and I've felt most awful ever since, but those poor, poor people. At this moment, Mrs. Bax came down onto the beach by the wooden steps that led from the sea wall where the grass grows between the stones. Hello, she said. Hurt yourself, my Dora dove? But Dora was rather a favourite of hers. It's all right now, said Dora. That's all right, said Mrs. Bax, who has learnt in Andy What's-its-name Climbs the great art of not asking too many questions. Antipodean, I think is what he means. Mrs. Redhouse has come to lunch. She went this morning to see that boy's mother, you know, the boy the others wouldn't play with. We said, yes. Well, Mrs. Redhouse has arranged to get the woman some work. Like the dear she is, the woman told her that the little lady, and that's you, Dora, had given the little boy £1.13 and 7p. Mrs. Bax looked straight out to sea through her gold-rimmed spectacles and went on, that must have been about all you had among the lot of you. I don't want to draw, but I think you're a set of little bricks, and I must say so, or expire on the sandy spot. Brick in this context, I think, is good. Good, solid person. H.O. looked, there, what did I tell you? At the rest of us. Then Alice said, we others had nothing to do with it. It was all Dora's doing. I suppose she said this because we did not mean to tell Mrs. Bax anything about it. And if there was any brickiness in the act, we wished Dora to have the consolement of getting the credit for it. But of course Dora couldn't stand that. She said, oh, Mrs. Bax, it was very wrong of me. It wasn't my own money, and I'd no business to, but I was so sorry for the little boy and his mother and his darling baby brother. The money belonged to someone else. Who? Mrs. Bax asked, ere she had time to remember the excellent Australian rule about not asking questions. And H.O. blurted out, it was Miss Sandal's money, every penny, before we could stop him. Once again in our career, concealment was at an end. The rule about questions was again unregarded, and the whole thing came out. It was a long story, and Mrs. Redhouse came out in the middle, but nobody could mind her hearing her things. When she knew all, from the plain living to the peddler who hadn't a licence, Mrs. Bax spoke up like a man and said several kind things that I won't write down. She then went on to say that her sister was not poor and needy at all, but that she lived plain and thought high just because she liked it. We were very disappointed as soon as we had got over our hardly believing anyone could like it, I mean. And then Mrs. Redhouse said, sorry, excuse me a minute. I'm nearly at the end of that chapter. I'll just try to get there. And then Mrs. Redhouse said, Sir James gives me £5 for the poor woman, gave me £5 for the poor woman, and she sent back 30 of your shillings. She had spent 3 and 7pence, and they had a lovely supper of boiled pork and greens last night. So now you've only got that to make up, and you shall buy a most splendid present for Miss Sandal. It is difficult to choose presents for people who live plain and think high, because they like it, but at last we decided to get books. They were written by a person called Emerson, and of a dull character, but the backs were very beautiful, and Miss Sandal was most awfully pleased with them when she came down to her cottage with her partially repaired brother, who had fallen off the scaffold when treating a bricklayer to tracts. This is the end of the things we did when we were at Lymchurch in Miss Sandal's house. It is the last story that the present author means ever to be the author of. So goodbye, if you have got as far as this. Your affectionate author, Oswald Bastable. So there you go. And that's the end of New Treasure Seekers. Oh my goodness. They didn't get into trouble. They did actually manage to improve some of the ways they did things a bit along the way and start considering others a little more. Still not understanding the full impact of some of the things that they do, but that's okay. Sorry, I've got something tickling my throat. And technically we're between chapters because I've just finished that chapter and it's time for you to have a drink too.